This is lesson 734, the Catholic Reformation, also called the Counter-Reformation. What reforms did the Catholic Church make, and how did it respond to Protestant reform movements? Intro. Like I just said, another common name for the Catholic Reformation is the Counter-Reformation, two names for the exact same thing. By the 1540s, the Catholic Church was faltering. The Catholic Church had lost millions of followers. Entire provinces had been lost to the Protestant Reformation. The attack on Catholic beliefs by Christian humanists and by Protestant reformers had caused a lot of doubt among Catholics, and these attacks undermined the Catholic clergy's own confidence in their church. How many of these attacks were valid? Was the Catholic Church still worth fighting for? Was the Catholic Church still relevant? The New World was opening up too, and the expansion of Europe into the New World needed to be a Catholic expansion. The Catholic Church needed to reorganize and revitalize if it was going to remain relevant and accomplish this task. Papal reform and the Council of Trent. And by the way, the word papal means having to do with the Pope of the Catholic Church. And Pope Paul III became Pope in the year 1534. He was a Roman nobleman. He was tough, he was skilled, and he was experienced. Pope Paul III wanted to do two important things. First, he wanted to reconvert Protestants wherever possible. And second, he wanted to convert people who were on the fence about their religion wherever possible. In order to do that, Pope Paul III needed to go on a militant, not military, we'll define this word militant in a second, on a militant counterattack. So Pope Paul III put together a three-part strategy. First, the Catholic Church had to clearly define its beliefs. Up to this point, the Catholic Church had never really done this in an outwardly focused way. Didn't need to. Everybody was Catholic. And they needed to clearly define some basic things. Who we Catholics are, who those Protestants are, what the differences are, and what the choices are. Next, they had to fix church discipline. The church needed stricter rules for behavior and corrupt practices. Priests needed better training, and a more aggressive organization needed to be created. Next, the Catholic Church had to take a new stand against the Protestants. The Catholic Church had been caught off guard by Protestant theologians like Martin Luther and John Calvin, and the church had to be more militant. And when we say militant, what we mean is more active, more vigorous, more assertive, forceful, fierce, passionate when it came to debating Protestants. Pope Paul III's actions. First, Pope Paul made it absolutely clear to the church that the Pope was the one who was in charge of the church. And second, he reformed various internal abuses. The church had to get its own house in order before it could go after the Protestants. In the year 1542, Pope Paul III established what was called the Roman Inquisition. It had another name too, the Holy Office. One thing, one institution, two names. And the Holy Office was a traveling court of 6 cardinals that tried cases of heresy. And when we say heresy, what we mean by that is religious error in either belief or practice. The Roman Inquisition, or as it was also known, the Holy Office, came directly from Rome, and it had authority everywhere. The Holy Office's mission on any case was to decide this: what teachings were within the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church, and what teachings were outside the teachings of the Church. And the Holy Office had the authority to arrest, imprison, and even execute heretics. The Holy Office published a yearly updated Index of Prohibited Books, and this Index of Prohibited Books was a list of books that true Catholics, true believers, were not to read. Christian humanist authors were on that list. All the Protestant authors were on that list. A lot of scientific books were on that list. and reading the books listed on the Index of Prohibited Books was considered a sin. In the year 1545, Pope Paul III called the Council of Trent together, and the goal of this council was to clearly define Catholic Church beliefs so that the Church could be ready to counterattack the Protestant Reformation intellectually. The council met and worked off and on from 1545 to 1563. That's 18 years. And finally, in the year 1563, the Council of Trent presented its legislation. This legislation came in two parts. In part one, the Council of Trent acknowledged that there were disciplinary problems that needed to be addressed, and the council introduced lots of new rules. For example, bishops now had to live where their dioceses were, and a diocese was a group of churches or a district of churches that were run by a bishop. There would be no more absenteeism, no more pluralism, no more simony, and these were all forms of church corruption. For example, absenteeism is a form of church corruption in which a member of the clergy gets paid for a position but isn't actually there to do the job. Pluralism is a form of corruption that's related to that. Pluralism is a form of corruption where a member of the clergy gets paid for two jobs. And simony is a form of corruption in which a member of the clergy buys an important church position rather than earning an important church position. There would be no more concubines for priests. In other words, priests couldn't have girlfriends. There would be no more sales of indulgences. You might still be able to get an indulgence, but the church wasn't allowed to sell you one. Every diocese had to establish a seminary, a school, to train and educate priests. And the training of priests needed to emphasize preaching and educating the laity, that is, the lay people, the regular churchgoers. Seminary professors had to evaluate whether or not a candidate had a genuine calling for the priesthood. And lay people, and by that we mean people who were not clergy, who got married had to take their vows in public before a priest and witnesses. That had not been a rule before, and it had caused lots of problems because two people, it's late at night, maybe they've been drinking, they get into a conversation, they decide that they're going to get married, that they're married to each other. The next day, one person says they're married, the other person says, you're crazy. I don't remember saying anything about that. So it was a big problem. Now a marriage had to be done in public, in writing, before a priest, and with witnesses. The second part of the Council of Trent's legislation was this. They reaffirmed Catholic Church doctrine and beliefs, and the council stood its ground in a clear, strong, and uncompromising way. In other words, the council made no effort at all to compromise with the Protestants in terms of doctrine and beliefs. And the message was simple. This is us. Here's what we stand for. That's them. That's what they stand for. Here's the line. Make your choice. And the choice you make has consequences. So the Council of Trent offered Christians a clear choice. Heaven or hell, us or them. Some specifics of the Council of Trent. All parts of Catholic Church doctrine that the Protestants had previously attacked were now reaffirmed by the Council of Trent. In other words, the Council of Trent officially stood behind every single Catholic belief that the Protestants had attacked them for. Here are just a few of the many heaven or hell, us or them Catholic doctrines that the Council of Trent held up as being totally true and accurate. For example, how do you get to heaven? The Council of Trent said it was a combination of faith and good works. The Protestants, as we have seen, had been saying that it was faith alone. Another example, all 7 sacraments were valid and essential. And we learned what sacraments were and what the 7 sacraments were last semester. The Protestants had been saying that there were only 2 sacraments, not 7. but the Catholic Church stuck to their guns and said, no, it is 7. Another example, the Council of Trent declared that Scripture, that is, the Bible, and church traditions, and church law, and the Pope's decrees were all equal as sources of truth and authority. The Protestants had argued for what was called sola scriptura, and this was the idea that the Bible was the only source of truth and authority for Christians. All other sources were suspect, sources like tradition or culture or church law or the Pope or priests. So the bottom line for the Council of Trent was this: hey, we admit that there are some disciplinary matters that we need to fix, but at the same time, we got the religious doctrine right the first time, and we're not changing any of that. We are ready to go toe-to-toe in vigorous debate with the Protestants anytime, anywhere. And the Council of Trent's 1563 legislation ruled the Catholic Church all the way up until the mid-20th century. That's the 1960s. There were also new and reformed religious orders to help with the Catholic Reformation. And these religious orders had several things in common. First, they were heavily influenced by the values of the Council of Trent. They emphasized education. They emphasized outreach. They wanted to improve society through Christian teaching and discipline. And they wanted to get out there and answer the arguments of the Protestants. Let's begin with St. Teresa of Avila. She was a Spanish noblewoman, and she belonged to an order of nuns called the Carmelites. And she became a social celebrity in her home province in Spain. And while recovering from a near fatal illness, she started getting quite dramatic mystical visions that lasted for 2 years and shaped the rest of her life. And Teresa wrote extensively in great detail about these visions and her life and her reform efforts and her religious views. And these writings greatly influenced church doctrine and practice. And Teresa of Avila traveled extensively, and she founded 17 new convents. Then we have Angela Merici, and she was Italian, and she spent years helping the poor, the sick, and the uneducated. And Merici founded the Ursuline Order of Nuns in the year 1565, and she dedicated this order to educating young girls. The order's goal was to re-Christianize all of society, specifically through the education of future wives and mothers. But the biggest one of all was the Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuits. These were the foot soldiers in the intellectual attack on the Protestants. They were at the heart of the Catholic Reformation, also known as the Counter-Reformation. They were a very intellectually aggressive order, and they had very definite beliefs. And they also had a very charismatic leader, Ignatius Loyola, or Ignatius of Loyola. The Jesuits were going to take the fight for the hearts and minds of the people straight to the Protestants. They started energetically reconverting converted Protestants, and they started going after the wavering masses, and they founded excellent schools all over the world. The 4 major functions of the Jesuits are, number 1, preaching. This preaching has to be skilled, it has to be convicted, and it has to be knowledgeable. 2, teaching. The teaching of doctrine, the teaching of the history of the church, and the teaching of proper behavior. Number 3, confession. Remember, that's a sacrament. Specifically, confession to the nobility, a position of great responsibility and power. And finally, missions, taking Catholicism all over the world. At this time, teaching and preaching were the very things that the Catholic Church had been notoriously bad at. Up to this time, the Protestants had had the superior knowledge and the superior eloquence. But now, the Jesuits were taking on the Protestants at their own game, and they were successfully out-arguing Protestants in public debate. and people were finally beginning to respect the Catholic Church again because they respected the Jesuits. The Jesuits excelled at worldwide missionary work. They vigorously spread the Catholic faith all over Asia and the New World. The Protestants weren't really doing this yet. Instead, they were leaving the mission field wide open for the Jesuits to expand into. The Jesuits concentrated on becoming advisors to important people. They forged the so-called alliance of throne and altar. And the Jesuits made a big effort to be close to the ruling nobles of Catholic Europe. And this gave the Jesuits great influence in political affairs.